Okay, it is now 10 o'clock, so I will turn it over to Professor Sarkissian.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here this morning. The second panel is called Investigating Religion, and we have three presenters for this panel, so I'm going to introduce each one of them before their presentations. So our first presenter is Leena Ghannam on Wrinkling Urban Fabric, Typology of Two Takiyas in 18th Century Ottoman Cairo. Leena Ghannam specializes in Islamic art and architecture at the American University in Cairo. Their research focuses on artistic encounters in medieval West Asia and North Africa, medieval image theory, object theory, spoliation, I think I pronounced that okay.
That was perfect.
Museum repatriation and archaeology of urban spaces. In the past, they worked at the Dallas Museum of Art, the Wayne State University Art Collection, and the Nadim Foundation. They've also conducted research on medieval Islamic metalware, Roman porphyry, and its neoclassical reuse, and the history of destruction and reconstruction of Islamic monuments in the Gaza Strip for Google Arts and Culture and the Barakat Trust. So, Leena Ghannam.
Great. Can you guys hear me okay, like this?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to thank Mary Firdausi and Mohammed Khalil for organizing this. I mean, I'm sure there's been many people at the back end, and everybody who's present, everybody who's a part of this department and has contributed. I really appreciate it. I also just want to say that this was written for a particular audience in mind, and so I know that a lot of the talks that we're hearing today are about modern politics. And so this has a lot of specific terms, so if there's something that I'm not explaining at all, or just I'm making assumptions about what people know and don't know, please feel free to ask even when I'm done, maybe. Okay, so 30 years before the overthrow of the Mamluks, who ruled Egypt from 1250 to 1517, a Muslim religious order called the Khalwatiyya, which is a branch of Tasawwuf or Sufism, had begun to find fertile intellectual ground among the Mamluk court. Sufism is defined roughly as a journey for an inner connection with God. And this is based on a hadith that says, "Die before you die, know thyself, know thy Lord." It was incorporated into Cairo's cultured urban tradition, facilitated by teachers and students from all over the Islamic world, cohabitating within the pre-existing institution of the Khanqa. And so Khanqa is a word of Persian origin meaning a place of the table or a place of recitation. And it was typically a building reserved for Sufis belonging to one of the Sufi orders. This institution often housed Sufi students in a communal atmosphere to act as a living space, school, and mosque. After the typology of the Khanqa came to Egypt from Khorasan in the 12th century, Cairene architecture saw the establishment of the Khanqa morph in its architectural plan, use, scale, and decorative style. And so this is an example of a Mamluk Khanqa. With Ottoman Turkish being the new lingua franca of the state, so too came a shift in administrative and legal terminology for building typologies. The etymology of tekke, as used in Ottoman Turkish, originally came from the word takiya in Arabic, meaning place or thing on which one relies, where one rests. These terms can be used as synonyms perhaps, contingent upon the assumption that they served as an identical charitable purpose. They certainly share a core, unique, and architectural feature, however, which is the small cell for aesthetic meditation, or khalwa, especially vital for the isolated transcendence required of its prayer in the midst of Ottoman Cairo's dense urban landscape. The mid-18th century of Ottoman Cairo is often understood as politically unstable in the aftermath of the relatively peaceful yet obsessively opulent Tulip period. This was marked not only by the eventual deposition in Istanbul of Sultan Ahmed III by a certain coffee shop owner named Petrona Halil and his supporters in 1730. But this period was also rife with residual political infighting in the Egyptian province and increasing frustration at the austerity of the Ottoman sultans and visibly exploitative tax farming. In the midst of this political instability, what took place in Al-Azhar, the historically state-run and administrative mosque of Cairo, was what Rashida Chi calls a Sufi revivalist movement. So, in the 18th century, Mustafa al-Bakri, who's attributed with propagating the revival of the Khalwatiyya practices in Egypt, came from Aleppo to Cairo in 1720. And as I previously mentioned, the Khalwatiyya order used solitary cells for ascetic meditation, for which the order is named. As Syria was also in the Ottoman imperial region, and was a margin like Egypt, it was influenced by the popularity of the Khalwatiyya order amongst the sultans, especially because the Ottoman state found it a useful tool to promote Sunni theology in opposition to their opponent Shia empire, the Safavids. Under the Ottomans, Sufi sheikhs became intimately involved with both the state and religious institutions, as Sheikh al-Hifni did in the 1750s and 60s. And as a student of al-Bakri and a professor himself at Al-Azhar for 10 years, he brought masses of Egyptians to discover and join the Khalwati order. Despite the fact that Sufi spaces aim to cultivate piety, Khankas and Takiyas are distinguishable from the monastery typology, not merely because of their architectural facades, which took part in the semiotics of Cairo's urbanism, but because the Sufi travelers themselves routinely participated in urban life itself. Daily and evening public rituals, weekly Friday street parades, and frequent visits to the madrasas, mosques, and teaching circles kept the Sufi travelers involved in the communal life of Cairo. As Michael Winter highlights, funerary practices, or dikh, or zikr in Amriya, during saints' days or molids were part of the urban and even secular fabric, as Takiyas functioned as agencies of welfare and charity. They were commercial centers and notoriously carnivalesque affairs, the molids, that sparked controversy regarding their alleged profanity. This implicates an explicitly urban interaction between the foreign Turkish students who would come and study in Cairo and the local Cairenes who partook in the charitable free meals. And so these are three early Sufi architectural examples that are covered in a article by Doris Behrens Abu Saif and Eleanor Fernandez, which conclude that there is no unitary Sufi style. And so they say that when considering common participation in an urban context, these buildings have more to do with the respective Sufi sheikhs that established these buildings, rather than the distinct role of Sufism within the local community. And so they're quite individualized buildings. And they were also quite adaptable to the landscape and intended usage of their surrounding communities. But it is indeed a unanimous feature in all of these buildings that there are rooms for ascetic meditation or khalwa. And so this continues to be true in the later Ottoman period with some distinct differences, which I'll talk about. And so this concept of solitary isolation and meditation is important to keep in mind as we begin to decipher the visual and spatial semiotics of later Takiyas, of which there are two that I will be focusing on from the 18th century. That is the Takiyya Mahmudiyya on Port Said Street, and the Takiyya Rafa'iyya in Bulat. And I mentioned their locations in order to introduce a crucial point, which is that despite the asceticism practiced in the khalwa, or the cell, these architectural works were built in a densely urban context. And so I've just pointed it out on a Google map here, but, and you can see how sort of far away they are, with the Nile on the left. But both were located near water, which is an important point, and which you can see where I've marked them on this map depicting late 18th century Cairo. So you can see that the Mahmudiyya, which is like more in the center, and maybe I can, this just says Takiyas here. So you can see that it's next to this big body of water here, which is no longer there. Now all of this land, as you can see in this image, it's just land. There's no more canal. So this map shows a comparison with a map illustrating the urban spread of Cairo, just at the time of their foundation. And so following the Patrona Halil uprising, which forced the abdication of Sultan Ahmed III in 1730, his successor, Sultan Mahmud I, spent the first few years of his power garnering public support, stifling a second uprising in the following year, and also locked in a border dispute between the Russians, Safavids, and Habsburgs for the remaining 2 decades of his rule. So he was quite busy. And these diplomatic obligations occupied him until 1748, when further internal disruption, including a Janissary revolt in Istanbul, produced another climactic breaking point of his control. And it was only shortly after these distractions subsided that the Takiyya Mahmudiyya was established in 1750, 233 years after Ottoman conquest of Egypt, which makes it the earliest example of a religious institution founded by an Ottoman sultan in Cairo. So why did it take such a long time? Why was there such a belated effort to establish a religious institution in Cairo from the Ottoman sultan? So I argue that because of this long delay of instability, as I've just mentioned, it's hard to control Egypt, especially considering these revolts. But furthermore, the Sufi revival that was taking place in Egypt at this exact period prompted the dispatch of Turkish Sufi teachers to Cairo, which solidified both local and imperial Ottoman identity in their now shared khalwati, or like aesthetic Sufi practices. So here you can see a Sabil Kutab, which is a sort of popular typology that was, there have been many of these in those 233 years established, but it's not by the Sultan, typically. I mean, this is the only example that you can see on the left, which is the Takiyya Mahmudiyya. But typically they are on their own, and they're established by princes and local emirs, members of the military, who are wealthy and have enough money to have these kinds of investments in the public. And so you can see it attached to the broader Takiyya building here. And so there are several instances of epigraphy on this building. One of which is a tura, which is spelled Tugra, which is an Ottoman word referring to the blazon of the Sultan. So it's like the symbol, and this is pasted all over this building. And so it indicates that Bashir Ada, who was a black eunuch, used as a proxy for commissioning and designing the building for the Sultan. He was very skilled at calligraphy, and we can see that in many examples of epigraphy in the building. And he did so without ever visiting Cairo. It was all done remotely, just sending plans from Istanbul to Cairo. And so other influences besides Cairo, besides Istanbul on Cairo, includes this Janissary class that I've mentioned before, who are often sponsoring these Sabil Kutabs, which are fountains that have schools for young boys to teach the Quran to them. It's like a composite purpose of this building. And so one of them was a man named Abdurrahman Khatkhouda, who was a wealthy son of a Janissary emir and a sponsor of numerous unique buildings in Ottoman Cairo during the mid-18th century. And so unprecedented is the decor and the lavishness of his facades that they're described by Abu Saif as their own architectural style. And so, for example, we can see an instance of that style here, where it's this very exaggerated sort of squiggle line done under the archway. There's a more artistic way of referring to it besides squiggle, it's a cushion, but art and architectural terms are too specific sometimes. So you can see these three examples. So Bab al-Futuh is one of the main gates to enter the old city of Cairo. And so this was 600 years prior to the foundation of Takiyya Mahmudiyya. So it's recalling this very old style, which is also done by Abdurrahman Khatkhouda's building, as you can see here. It contains both this this sort of toothed arch and this cushion arch. And so we can also see a blending of the Istanbul imperial style here. Both of Abdurrahman Khatkhouda's building on the left has Iznik tiles, which are taken from Turkey, taken from the imperial center, from the metropolis, and brought to Cairo. And you can see the same thing is done at the same time, roughly, just 6 years later, in the Mahmudiyya. And so what do these similar styles mean for urban semiotics? My interpretation is that the imperial elite in Istanbul understood the benefit of imitating Cairene tastes to improve their image with their subjects, posing themselves as connected with their marginal province. Though the Mahmudiyya embodies current fashions, it also certainly has its own Istanbuli spin on it. And so we can see that here in the ground plan of the Mahmudiyya, which shares a very similar plan with the Nurul Osmani complex in Istanbul, roughly built around the same time, although it's a bigger complex, so it might have taken longer to build. You can see that all of these tiny circles on the perimeter of these squares. So here, all of these rooms, all of these rooms here, these are all of the cells that are part of imperial buildings for people to meditate inside of in a dense urban landscape. And so those rooms lie beneath each dome and perhaps served as khalwa. In Earl Waugh's book on zikr, or remembrance or prayer, he notes that there was limited space for hosting these kinds of meditations, but it was a very densely built urban area, so there wasn't much space to spread out into. And so this is why celebrations of the Prophet's birthday, for instance, would be very chaotic affairs that would often get qadis, judges involved, and start to say this is an unethical celebration. There was too much violence, for instance, that were happening at these because it was too busy and crowded. And so there was also extensive staff to educate the Sufi students, and this is outlined in the Takiyya Mahmudiyya's Waqf, which is the establishment deed of the building. And so one scholar, Shahinda Karim, she wrote, the madrasa was designed to accommodate 40 students to study with a Quran teacher. There was also a large staff of administrators and workers. The Kutab, the school for teaching Quran to young schoolboys, was dedicated to 20 of them. And a Quran teacher with an assistant, as well as Quran reciters and an Arabic teacher were needed. one may assume that the staff were mostly Turks, which necessitated an Arabic teacher. And so with the shared Khalwati Sufi identity between the Ottoman, Istanbul, and Cairo public, the interaction between the local teachers and visitors to the Takiya and the foreign Turkic students could be interpreted as functioning as a humanizing effort for the relationships between the imperial Ottoman sultans and teachers and the local Egyptian public. And so this also has to do with this notion of transversal affiliation. And a scholar called Richard McGregor coins this term to describe how, as opposed to earlier forms of Sufism, which required blood relation in order for a man to become a Sufi sheikh or teacher, now you just have to be close to him and be his friend. And now it doesn't matter if you're related to him or not, anybody can become a teacher. And so this also expands who can become a part of the order. And so, of course, this means that Turkish and Egyptian students and eventually sheikhs are living together and working together. And so here's another map of Takiya Rafaiya, which is here, and this is where the Mahmudi is, and you can see here where the water used to be. This was the river or the canal, no longer extant. And so Oulat now, as you can probably see in this photo on the left, is a densely urban area, and this building is threatened to be destroyed. I feel both of these buildings that I'm showing you here are very hard to access for the public and now have the Supreme Council of Antiquities in them. Like they just have their offices in them, so it's very hard to go inside, and which was especially the case here. And so because Takiya Rafaiya is on the Nile, it was the first thing that Turkish students would see as they're coming down the Nile. And it's also the last thing they see when they leave back to Turkey. And so the comparison of the two Takiyas shows the similarity of the solitary cells, as you can see in the photo on the right, all of the rooms surrounding the central one. And as opposed to the last Takiya we just saw, this did not have imperial patronage. So it was not modeled after this imperial Ottoman rectangular plan that we just saw as right here. So it's a very different look. Sorry, excuse me. And originally this building was just a grave and a small mosque above it. But it sort of changed slowly over the years and was completed in 1774 after the death of its first patron, who was ironically killed by the person who completed the building. And so because of this, there's a lot of layers of history of this building, and I'm not quite sure when its construction actually began, but it contained the body of a sheikh called El-Maghrabi, who was a Maliki jurist. And so it was used for pilgrimage, this building. And according to El-Jabarti, who's a chronicler of the 18th century, there were a lot of commercial constructions by the Mamluk Bey or ruler, and he famously rebelled against the Ottoman sultans. And so building this this Takiya was also a way of accepting other Turkish students in and also becoming popular with local Cairene subjects. And so, as I mentioned before, they were quite chaotic affairs. Some of the birthday celebrations of Ahmed al-Rafaiya, who was the founder of this order, and it attracted a lot of attention, his birthday, where travelers allegedly witnessed elaborate practices of snake charming and thrusting iron spikes into their bodies without bleeding. Lots of the very scandalous things that people hear about when they hear about Sufi orders and some of their religious practices. And so this building had markets, a shop downstairs. It had a grain storage area, the mausoleum, which I mentioned. And you can see that this second floor likely held more takiya small rooms for solitary meditation. So that's no longer there. And all that remains are these ones on the ground floor. And so this is the mihrab, or the niche towards the Kaaba, towards which people pray. And here's another one of these seals of the Ottoman elite here. And so here we can see some more revivalist elements, recalling back the classical nature of Ottoman Cairene buildings, with the Abdurrahman Khuda style, as I mentioned, and its Fatimid revivalist elements. And here we can see another comparison, which when I was looking closely at Takiya Rafaiya on the right, I was looking closely and I realized I could see tiny swastikas, which is a popular symbol all over the world. But I was curious to see what its relationship was with the Sufi building. And it's also in this Abdurrahman Khuda mosque that you see on the left, from a very similar, just within 20 years, same time period. Waugh explains that this was due to an increasing popularity of occult and Eastern Gnostic asceticism. So this element is also present in the constructions in the 18th century. And so the building has changed a lot, the Takiyya Rafaiya. And it was moved entirely in 1936 to a new street, but was roughly in the same area. And so there has been a rich dynamic political, intellectual, and commercial relationship between the Egyptian state and the sultans in Istanbul. And it's crucial to understanding the residual culture and urbanism in Cairo. It also allows us to examine the modern Eurocentric paradigms historians find themselves in to this day, secluded from the untapped approaches from the field. And one such approach is to understand the effect of architectural typology on the urban community in an effort to deduce sociological interactions. In my use of the word topology for this presentation, I thought back to this quote from Bashir and his seminal work regarding the sensuality of an interior. So he writes, and so faced with these periods of solitude, the topo analyst starts to ask the questions. Was the room a large one? Was the garret cluttered up? Was the nook warm? How was it lit? How to, in these fragments of space, did the human being achieve silence? How did he relish in the very special nature, in the very special silence of the various retreats of solitary daydreaming? And so revisiting the solitary nature of these cells for prayer, it brings to bear the paradox of the Takiyya topology, where it's a space of culture, foreign students, celebration, charity, and public gathering, but also allows for this solitary daydreaming, which allows one to reach towards God and become one with God. And so this sets up a relationship that we can understand as interwoven between Sufism and political semiotics within the urban environment. And it also dissolves this two-tier model of elite and popular practice, similar to the illusion of private and public in the Muslim city. These binaries don't really work for the way we study a lot of these urban contexts. And so Sufism is a cosmopolitan religion. it still exists. And it has always been a sort of diplomatic lubricant for whatever ruling power exists, even in the negotiations with Napoleon at the end of the 18th century. Yeah, thank you so much.
And I just want to, thank you, Leena, I just want to interject and say that was our first in-person conference presentation since 2019.
Oh my God. All right, well, Mohammed gets this set up. I'm going to introduce our next presenter. So our next presenter is Marwa Shalaby. She's an assistant professor in the departments of Gender and Women's Studies and Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining the University of Wisconsin, Shalaby was the fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights in the Middle East program at Rice University and a visiting scholar in the Governance and Local Development Institute at the University of Gothenburg. Her research areas are gender politics, authoritarianism, and research methodology. Her work focuses primarily on the intersection of legislative politics, authoritarianism, and women in politics in the Middle East and North Africa region. Her presentation today is entitled "How Opposition Movements Use Legislative Powers in Authoritarian Regimes, Evidence from Islamist Groups in the Arab World."
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for Dr. Khalil and Mary for organizing such an important event. I'm sorry for not being able to be there in person. My flight got canceled because of the bad weather. So just before I start, I would like to introduce myself. This is Marwa Shalaby, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I study legislative politics, authoritarianism, and gender politics. The paper I'm presenting today is part of a larger project on authoritarian legislatures with a special focus on the Middle East and North Africa region. The paper is entitled "How Opposition Movements Use Legislative Powers in Authoritarian Regimes, Evidence from Islamist Groups in the Arab World," and it is a co-author paper with Professor Scott Williamson at Bocconi University. So before I start kind of in a nutshell, kind of what's the motivation of this project and this paper. So we know that from previous research that scholars have increasingly recognized the relevance of legislatures to political and policy outcomes in authoritarian regimes. But there is little research that analyzes systematically how opposition groups they use legislative representation to influence policy makings in these contexts. So thinking, for instance, here about Jordan and the Islamist opposition in Jordan. We know that the Jordanian monarchy is pretty apprehensive from the Islamist opposition, and this was very clear in different work published in Jordan over the last few decades, and how there is always this kind of consistent historical evidence of repression, as well as moments of cooptation, mainly of letting Islamists in the parliament, seeing some dynamics of power sharing, and letting them actually run and win seats. And there's also instances of collaboration and coordination with the monarchy. But also drawing on thinking about the cooptation literature in particular, not just in Jordan, but also in other settings across the MENA region, it is not really necessarily clear how does this cooptation take place? What happens after these opposition groups enter the parliament? Do they have any influence? Do they have power? What kind of policy agendas that they focus on? So do they just play too nice with the regime once the autocrat agree to share some power with them? Or do they engage in service provision and other clientelistic patronage, just like everybody else? So what exactly do they do when they get to power? So this is kind of motivation of this project. And before I answer the many questions that I raised, I want to start with kind of giving a brief overview of the previous literature and showing what kind of reiterating actually the existing gaps that we are trying to address in this project before I talk about our theoretical framework and the design and findings. So thinking about cooptation theories, so previous work shown that authoritarian legislatures, they facilitate cooptation, that MPs in these settings are simply there to provide limited representation, facilitate patronage distribution, and it's all about how these cooptation mechanisms work. But what we really don't know is how do these opposition MPs use these formal powers to advance policy agendas? So are they submissive? Are they cautious to protect their positions? Or do they use their powers to push for issues they really care about? And how does this vary across countries? Is this kind of a uniform kind of pattern, or are there some kind of variation across settings that can be interesting in itself? So we focus in this specific paper on the Islamists in the MENA region. We do understand that Islamists is only one of the opposition groups, or not the only opposition group, but we do compare, for now, this phase of the project, we focus mainly on Islamists, and we try to compare Islamist MPs from the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi backgrounds to MPs from pro-government parties and other ideological backgrounds in Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco. So Islamist parties have become very powerful actors in MENA's political scene since the 1970s. In much of the Middle region, including the 3 countries in our analysis, Islamist actors have been the most organized opposition group with coherent policy stances that formed a single, but not necessarily a homogeneous Islamist field. They are particularly helpful for studying policy-oriented cooptation and how it functions in authoritarian legislatures. So also our cases really offer a very interesting variation of this opposition group. So Morocco stands out as a unique case of well-structured opposition group, the Islamists, that managed to govern for almost a decade. In contrast, in Jordan and Kuwait, the Islamists face minimal repression from the regime, but they are historically unable to form a unified front against the monarchy due to the structure of the electoral system in place and the malproportional districts. That's something that we can talk more about in the Q&A if people are interested to know more about that. So Kuwait has one of the most vibrant legislatures in the region, where Islamist groups continue to be a strong front, but they never actually formed the majority. They have always been the minority in the legislature. So we do focus on Islams in particular in this paper, and we know that there's so much research on the Islamist mobilization, organization, patronage delivery, religious appeals, but not necessarily how they act and behave within the legislature, and how they use these powers to advance their own agendas. So how do we do this? So we focus mainly on parliamentary queries. And why do we focus on parliamentary queries? They are a very useful tool to pressure the government and raise issue salience, and also to signal commitment to the supporters. Our analysis addresses 3 main areas. We focus mainly on how do they ask, whether Islamist MPs, they ask more questions. This is the first question that we're interested in. Second question, do they actually ask more questions about issues that are sensitive to the regime? And the third issue that we care about is, do they ask more questions that addresses their policy preferences? Our data is from 3 countries, as I mentioned. We have 2 sessions from Jordan, 2 sessions from Kuwait, and only 1 session from Morocco. And we can talk more about that and what does it mean when it comes to us understanding our findings. We also, our topics, so the topics are all classified or coded according to 22 broad categories. And out of these broad categories, we created 3 main areas. So or three main coding schemes. So the first one is about sensitive issues, where we code it according to whether the question deal with civil rights, law enforcement, corruption, defense, foreign affairs, religion, and citizenship. Social issues, whether it's religion, women and children, and education. You will notice there's some overlap between the categories, and we can talk more about and why we coded them that way. And there's also a third issue that we coded according to is macroeconomy, banking, welfare, government operations. And we also included some of the MPs' descriptive characteristics, such as their political expertise, affiliation, gender, and in order, to, of course, to capture these political opponents and how they behave in these settings. So just to look at the plot very generally, so this is just simply the average number of questions asked for the three aggregated categories that I just mentioned, and also we mentioned their constituent parts. So we have here like the civil rights, the crime, the corruption, defense, and these are the parts of the sensitive issues, and then we have the education and women and social affairs, which is part of the social, and so on. So that's kind of give you an idea the main measure or the main outcome and its components. And on average, and if you're looking at the three cases, there are three main patterns are very clear from this graph. First, on average, Islamists do ask more questions that are sensitive and are focused on social economic issues associated with their policy agendas. The second pattern that's also pretty clear from this graph is that their differences are not really driven by specific issues, but they're consistent across all of these used to create the aggregate measures. The third pattern that we notice here as well is that the total number of questions asked on average by MPs is particularly high in Kuwait, with lower levels of overall activity in Morocco and in Jordan. To analyze this more systematically and to see whether MPs ask more questions on average, we use negative binomial regression models where outcome is account variable. We have, of course, a reason why we use negative binomial. We have lots of zeros, as many MPs not asking questions. And we also have controls for, as I mentioned before, the MP age, gender, votes, and political expertise. All models are aggregated across countries, and we also have them for each of the countries. So here is our first table that we constructed, the dependent variable, which is just as simple as do Islamist MPs ask more questions. So this table shows a correlation between being an Islamist MP and the total number of queries posed to the government. The results suggest that Islamists tend to ask more questions than others in parliament, and the coefficient in column 1 is significant as 0.05, as you can see here, and we see smaller effects when the control variables are included in table 2, but it remains significant though. So column 3 through 5, they present the results for Jordan, Morocco, and Kuwait respectively. For both Jordan and Kuwait, Islamists ask more questions on average. However, as we see here for Morocco, the coefficient was insignificant and negative, suggesting that Islamists ask fewer questions when controlling for other legislator characteristics. Thus, in the two countries where Islamists hold seats but not central to the governing coalition, they use their positions to interrogate the government more than others. However, where Islamist MPs have more power in the cabinet and forming the governing coalition, they were less likely to query ministers. I'm going to move to, I think I am running out of time, but I will move also to our next model where our main dependent variable is the sensitive issues, or issues that are politically fraught or controlled by the regime. And as I mentioned before, these are the different issues or the different topics that we included in the sensitive issue coding. And here are the results for the sensitive issue dependent variable. So we ran the same model, the negative binomial, same thing, with the sensitive questions as a main dependent variable, and the results for the sensitive questions are actually similar to those for the overall queries. So in the aggregate data, Islamist MPs were more likely than others in parliament to ask questions about politically sensitive topics, ranging from corruption to foreign affairs. The Islamist coefficient is significant at 0.01 without any controls, and at 0.05 when the controls are incorporated. So the magnitude of the coefficient is also larger than it's for the total question and outcome. So moving also to our next coding of the second category, which is the social issues, which relate to religion, women and children, and education. And we use this as our main dependent variable for this model. Where we find also that that Islamists are more likely than other MPs to ask about social issues that relate to their social conservative ideology, which, as I mentioned in the previous slide, relating to religion, children, women, and education. This pattern holds in the aggregate data and with and without controls, and the magnitude. And this pattern holds in and the magnitude of the relationship again implies a substantively significant increase relative to their non-Islamist counterparts. We also ran here models with economic issues, which are issues relating to their emphasis on economic issues in their agendas. And we actually found less consistent evidence, and Islamists actually ask more economy-related questions, despite the fact that these issues are always featured prominently in their platforms. The Islamic coefficient is marginally significant in column 1 and loses significance in column 2, and the rest of the models as we see here. So just to sum our findings and talk a little bit about future directions. So just kind of to summarize what we found, that Islamists use parliamentary seats to advance their agendas. They do ask more questions, they ask more sensitive issues on more sensitive issues, and they also on topics that reflect their social policy agenda. There are differences across countries with less Islamist activity in Morocco. And we end the paper and thinking, is this more kind of a co-optive, more effective kind of cooptation when Islamists are in Morocco in government? So it becomes less likely to challenge the regime or ask questions that would embarrass the autocrats. So these are kind of our preliminary findings, and there's so much work to do. It's still work in progress. But in our next round of revisions of this paper, we want to add more, do more work on Morocco and see whether the affiliation of the minister matters. And so if a question is posed to an Islamist minister by an Islamist MP, would this actually be less or more sensitive? So we need to do some matching with the person, the MP and the minister and their party affiliation, and see if this actually affecting the patterns that we're seeing. We also want to include more legislative sessions in Morocco, since we only have one. And we also, I think, need to have a look at the other opposition groups other than the Islamists and see how they compare. So this is all we have for now. And thank you so much for your attention and for listening to this presentation. Please, I really look forward to your comments. This is, again, still work in progress, and any feedback would be very appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shalaby. I'm going to introduce the next speaker, the final speaker, while Mohammed gets the video set up. So our next speaker is Dr. Geon Hassan. He's a researcher at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies at Konkuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, South Korea. His primary fields of study are the political economy of the Middle East, sociopolitics of the Middle East, democratic transitions in the Middle East, political Islam, and geopolitics of the Middle East. His PhD is in political science with a specialty in the Middle East and African studies from Konkuk University. The title of his talk today is The Impact of Threat Perception Among Egyptians on the Disillusionment with Democracy After the Arab Spring.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. In the beginning, I would like to thank the organizers, attendees, and my fellow presenters today. I especially want to thank Professor Muhammad Khalil, the director of Michigan State University Muslim Studies program, for giving me this opportunity to present today. I am delighted to participate in the 16th annual conference, Measuring Muslim Public, and I would love to extend my sincere thanks to the conference organizers, Professor Russell Lucas and Professor Camelia Sulaiman, as well as the administrative lead, Mary Ferdowsi, and the session moderator, of course, Annie Sarkissian. I wish I could be able to meet you all in person on the campus of Michigan State University, but unfortunately, I'm residing in South Korea, which is located at the other end of the world from where you are right now. It's time right here is after midnight. Let me start my presentation today, the impact of threat perception among Egyptians and the disillusionment with democracy after the Arab Spring. Here today we are going to talk about why the Egyptians abandoned their support for democracy in 2013, only 2 years after staging major protests demanding regime change in Tahrir Square in 2011. And second, how several cues created by domestic and regional events induced stronger security and stability demands. After that, how the public paid close attention to powerful and intense occurrences, which prompted a preference for the strongman model, and how the fear of Islamists pushed the public mass to update their preference and seek the help of the old regime alliances, and then reintroduce authoritarianism. For decades, the Arab world as a whole, and Egypt in particular, stood out as an authoritarian outlier, rejecting repeated waves of democratization in other parts of the world. As the scholar Guillermo Donel has argued that the central argument for democratic consolidation is to prevent a successful military coup. Egypt, of course, has failed that test. To account for the Arab world democratic deficit, explanations for this outcome tend to highlight structural and cultural issues. According to modernization theory and economic studies, economic development, high level of education, other scholars also highlighted the alleged incompatibility of the Islamic religion and liberal democracy. For example, why is it the mass mobilization may be widely democratic at one point in 2011, but then emphasize security over democracy only a few years later in 2013? So that we need a more dynamic set of explanatory variables to explain that. Individuals usually rely on clues to make decisions and change preference during fast-paced transitions. Events that pose direct dangers to personal or communal security are more likely to garner attention than more common ones. In such cases, citizens are motivated by fears and uncertainties to embrace new political choices, even those that would weaken democracy. Harold Laswell claimed that whether democratic regimes emerge and survive largely depends on mass beliefs. Similarly, when Seymour Martin Lipst analyzed why modernization is conducive to democracy, he concluded that the modernization changes mass orientations in ways that make people supportive of democratic principles. How negative perception of democracy arose as a result of local and regional changes, resulting in increased needs for security and stability. As you can see from the figure, perception of threat among Egyptians during the transition period led to activation of cognitive heuristics and intuitive judgment, and that led to withdrawal of support for democracy, beginning with the Muslim Brothers' rise in Egypt and later entrenched by the outbreak of civil wars and the rise of violent Islamist extremist organizations in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen. An important approach among those who see a preference for authoritarian as activated when the fear of threats drives people to trade liberties for securities, a process in which the population seemingly actively support the government's efforts to eradicate the source of threat. It all depends on the cognitive biases. Perceived threat activates intuition and incites people to rely on a limited number of heuristics principles to reduce the complexity of assessing to simpler judgmental operations through selective perception and exposure. When it comes to making judgments or changing political beliefs, two major cognitive biases act as psychological cues: the availability and representative biases. In Egypt, after 2013, the opposition use of national fervor acted as a cue for all the officials to consider intervening in the game to restore unified social order and silence social strife. Meanwhile, growing antagonism between the Muslim Brotherhood and political opponents exasperated the need to withdraw support for democracy and increase security demands. Avoiding the fate of the neighboring war-torn countries after revolution against the autocrats such as Syria, Iraq, and Libya was far more important than freedom of speech or other democratic components such as freedom of the press and rights to criticize the government. After the 2011 revolution, authoritarian collapse are periodically accompanied by significant political, social, and economic upheavals, which might have an impact on the judgment of democracy. When confronted with an objectively similar circumstances, a person with higher expectations may evaluate the situation to be more unfavorable than one with fewer expectations. I used the Arab Barometer survey data collected across two waves in 2011 and 2013 to demonstrate how the Muslim Brotherhood ascension to power caused fear and uncertainty that decreased democratic support. The 2011 wave captures the spirit of change after the momentary success of the mass protest in toppling the autocrat Mubarak. The 2013 wave captured the public attitude after the broad victory of the Islamists in the first parliamentary elections and the presidential elections, which could have pushed respondents to update their expectation about democracy and the outcomes to it proceeds. Looking at the results from the surveys, as we can see, the figure shows that support for democracy decreased between 2011 and 2013. In 2011, after the huge success of in unseating Mubarak, 16% of the Egyptians answered that democracy is completely appropriate for Egypt, but that dropped to 9% in 2013. The number of people who answered that they and their families do not feel safe increased from 49% to 78%. The number of respondents who answered that they do not trust the Muslim Brother increased from 45% to 71%. And the number of people who rated the economy as the biggest challenge facing their country was 81% in 2011 and increased to 90% in 2013. The number of people who thought that democracy might cause security instability in Egypt increased from 4% to 10%. The respondents who thought that the citizens of Egypt are not prepared for democracy increased from 12% to 17%. The support for an authoritarian leader increased from 57% to 61%. The ones who had a favorable opinion about democracy and thought that it's a better system for governing has sharply declined from 80% to 33%. All these results support the claim that support for democracy has decreased after the Muslim Brotherhood ascended to power in Egypt. Looking at this graph, shows that there is evidence that the Brotherhood was becoming unpopular after only 1 year in office, and that dissatisfaction with democracy was growing. 56% of the population answered that they have an unfavorable opinion of the Muslim Brother in 2014, up from only 20% in 2011. On the contrary, the number of people who favored the group declined from 75% in 2011 to only 38% in 2014. And here I have the results from the regression analysis, OLS, and that shows that the impact of fast transition and complicated events decreased the support for democracy by 95%, as shown in the bullet 1, 2, 3. These results support the claim that the fast transition period from the fall of Mubarak until the fall of Morsi, where people had to be summoned to vote for 3 important elections, parliament, the constitution, and presidential election, caused them to feel that politics is so complicated, and so they had to decide based on cues and intuition. The level of trust in distrust in the Muslim Brotherhood, which decreased the support for democracy with 95% confidence in 2013, as it's shown in Model 1 and 3, confirms the argument that distrust in the Muslim Brother caused the declining support for democracy. The results also showed that the perception of security and stability has contributed significantly to the decrease of support for democracy, as is presented in Model 1, 2, and 3. Being Muslim also decreased support for democracy. Being religious decreased it also, and the age also decreased it, but it's insignificant. And that leads us to the conclusion. This finding points to highly significant changes in Egyptian public opinion in the time between the democratic opening following the removal of Mubarak and the removal of Morsi. Support for democracy has fallen, and conditional support for anti-democratic leaders has risen significantly. With these overall shifts, one can also see the important changes in the basis of democratic support. 2 potentially contradictory groups were distinctively supportive in 2011: Islamists who saw a reason to support democracy as a mean to enhance the rule of religion in Egypt politics, and the usual suspect of modernization, who saw democracy as the means to advance their economic and other aspiration. Neither of these groups is now distinctive in their disillusionment with democracy. Although not quite captured by this individual level survey data, democratic attitudes are likely also to have been influenced by the measure taken in post-Morsi Egypt to organize society and public space directly, mainly against the Islamists and 2011 revolutionary forces. This presentation demonstrated why people's sentiments toward democracy are so volatile and why changes in public opinion and preferences are so unpredictable. Threat perception during a fast-paced transition era, according to these findings, could cause rapid reversal in democratic aspiration. This explains why al-Sisi was hailed as a national hero in Egypt for preventing the Muslim Brother terrorists' threat from spreading across the country. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And let me interject to just say that I'd like to invite every single one of you to join us for lunch after the Q&A at 11:15 right across the hall. So please, all of you are welcome. Those of you who are joining online, I wish I could teleport the food, but anyway, I'll turn it over now to the moderator. Dr. Sarkissian.
Thank you. Okay, so if you are on Zoom, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. We've got one already, and I will also be fielding questions from the audience. I don't see any hands up in the audience just yet. We've got one, so a couple. So let's start with in the audience, and then we'll
Thank you. I have a question for the first speaker on the wonderful architecture in Cairo, and I think a larger question about your methodology. How are you looking at the mix of these, Islamic buildings in the urban spaces? And, I think of Delhi, which is almost the same. You have all these, and you talked of the poetics of space, but just your general sense of your methodology about the past and the present. Thank you. It was a wonderful, really wonderful.
Thank you so much for your question and compliment. Generally with these kinds of things, the way that art historians approach addressing urban life and the way that a building is functioning socially and economically and all of this is to first look at the endowment deed of the building. And so as I was reading out about the teachers that are exactly how many teachers and exactly how many students are illustrated in the deed, and the people who are tasked with taking care of the building are obligated to follow it. And so this is a specifically Islamic structure of endowing buildings. And so when you have these kinds of deeds still available, a lot of them are owned by the government in Egypt, for instance, so it's hard to get a hold of them. But when you have them, it's very valuable, and they can describe exactly what the building used to look like as if you're walking through it. And so that's a great primary source. Another one is chronicles. So I listed a few, like El-Jabanti, for instance, is an 18th century chronicler. He is from Cairo, so I would call him a traveler, but he's describing the way things were. But for example, he did say that 3 Sufi sheikhs deposed El-Ghuri, which was the last Mamluk sultan. And he named somebody who comes from his time period, which was 200 years after that incident. So you have to take those chronicles with a grain of salt, and people tend to cross-reference them a lot. But that is another major source. As for using the poetics of space, I just find that text incredibly useful as a way of understanding the sensory relationship that we have with place and being in an interior and feeling at home. And so I've used it in a lot of my previous work, although I know it's not an Islamic document by any means, but I also find it useful and also a kind of timeless approach to think about the sensory. And I think that even medieval Muslim viewers were thinking about the humors a lot, and whether the colors in a space and how it would feel to them, and a sense of peace. And so that's also what I tend to be drawn to when I.
Thank you. I use the poetics of space too.
It's a great text, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions for Dr. Shalaby on the Zoom. So perhaps Dr. Shalaby, do you see those questions on Zoom?
Yes, I can.
Okay, just so I don't waste time reading them out. Perhaps you could kind of address both of those briefly.
Okay, so for the first question, I think for the question about do they actually get re-elected, is there any kind of reward for bringing up these questions from a voter perspective? Yes. So when one of the models that I presented on the sensitive issues. So we control for the political experience of the MP, which means whether they were elected again or not, how many cycles they got elected. So we see some evidence that those Islamists who raise sensitive questions are actually are more likely to be re-elected rather than those who don't. And the other part of your question about how are they perceived by the regime? It's different. So as I mentioned in the presentation, so we have three cases. Levels of repression were very different across the three cases. So some regimes would allow them to speak up and to be and kind of diffuse public anger in parliament and raise sensitive questions and kind of controversial issues. Some don't. And sometimes the same regime can tolerate, and I think Annie knows way more about this more than me, sometimes regimes can tolerate repression at some points. And as our presenter was just saying, in times of threat, time where there's a high levels of threat perception, they wouldn't tolerate the controversial views. So it really depends what's the state of the regime and what kind of contextual and what kind of political environment is going on as well. The second question, if the levers of power relax to allow parliament to genuinely contribute to good governance compared to pre-2011 conditions. Okay, so basically thinking about the effect of the Arab uprisings on the quality of governance and how the parliament is contributing to this. So I do have another paper, it's under review now, where we actually talk about this specifically, where we're seeing really so much difference between pre and after 2011, and especially in the same three monarchies that I discuss in this paper, in Jordan, Morocco, and Kuwait, where political change did not really take place, but there were many constitutional reforms that took place during after the uprising in particular, in order to avoid escalation of tension. So we do see some difference before and after the Arab uprisings when it comes to the function of these parliaments. They're not to be compared with the Congress. These are parliaments operating under authoritarian regimes. So we also need to think about that they fulfill a different function rather than them being similar to assemblies and Congress, like in more democratic settings. So, but comparing to their performance and the role in governance before and after the Arab uprisings, I would definitely say there is a difference, even looking at the sheer number of questions asked before versus the number of questions asked after the Arab uprisings. There is a huge rise in the amount of even parliamentary activity and the amount of bills being pushed, the amount of deliberations, the committee meetings, like there's even sheer numbers different. So yes, there is a difference, but of course we need to put in perspective. That's not a democratic setting where these parliaments are acting without restrictions or without any constraints.
Thank you, Dr. Shalaby. And I think we have a couple of questions by our organizers, so I'm going to give them the floor.
Maybe we get to the, because I have a question for Dr. Hassan, so want to do both. Yeah. Okay, I want to thank the three presenters. This was fascinating. I have a quick question for Dr. Hassan. If you thought of a comparative study, since you put security in opposition to democracy in some of these graphs, whether you checked in other countries. Thank you.
And Dr. Hassan, there's another question for you in the Q&A, so if you'd like to address that one as well, please feel free to.
Hello, can you hear me? The sound is okay. For the question in the Q&A, I will answer first. The second question from the organizer, I couldn't hear it well, the last one, the security versus disillusionment with democracy. So what's the question? I can hear that there's no sound.
If you're considering a comparative study with other countries, other continents.
Okay, I see. First, I will answer the question from the Q&A. He said, anonymous. Yeah, He said, why would Egyptians trade democracy for security? Why wouldn't they try to choose another party or something, or change the regime in a democratic way? Of course, this is the point of my presentation. I wish they could do that, but as you might know, the Egyptians, they don't have the history of democratization. They don't have the culture of democracy. They haven't had democracy all their lives. So, and they had a great expectation. The last part of my presentation, that they had great expectations of democracy. They expect democracy to bring economic welfare, basically, not democratic freedom or freedom of speech or something. They don't look forward for the freedom of speech or human rights that much, more than the economic welfare. So they expected a lot of the Muslim Brothers regime in 1 year, and they failed. They couldn't get what they expected. So they had the fast transition, the fast-paced transition, so they could just rely on their intuition, not the rationale. They didn't think much of what they can do. Like, for example, Tunisia. In Tunisia, they endured the hardship of democracy, of the transition to democracy, and then they crossed over to a little bit of democratization, and they followed after that. But for Egyptians, they just relied on they give the sign to the old regime officials to interfere, and they did. Like the army, they interfered already, and they gave the army gave them the green light to go out. So it's okay to protest. It's okay to go out to protest in the street. And Egyptian people, they really love to celebrate. So if it's easy to go out and demonstrate and protest against the ruler, they will just do it, even without thinking about the outcome. So that's what happened. I was in Egypt during that time, and we went out to the street. I went out with my family just to celebrate the new canal, celebrate something. They don't think politically. They don't think of the democracy or something. So the millions in the streets in 2013, not all of them were just against the Muslim Brother, or not all of them were just demanding regime change just for after thinking. They just relied on cues and intuition. That's my answer to this. And the results from the Arab barometer, they showed that according to the regression, they proved this point, that people's worrying about their security after 2013 more than they worried about their security after 2011. So in 2011, the regression analysis showed insignificant results, but in 2013, they showed significant results related to their safety and family security. About other countries, I haven't compared the other countries. That was a case study for Egypt only. Maybe later I will see other countries.
Thank you. I think Dr. Shalaby has something to add.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hassan, for this great presentation. I just want to challenge you a little bit on your findings. And one thing that I would actually raise is I wrote a paper, it's published in PRQ. It's an experimental paper where we actually test exactly what you're saying in this paper. And it actually was not that. What we found that it's more about the cues from the regime itself, not necessarily what I think about the instability, but what the regime messages.
Yes. Right? Yes. It's same. The cues from the regime is they read the public read the cues from the regime, so they went out. Yeah.
Yes,
it was easy.
So it's an experiment on tolerance, right? So if you just have a look, because I think it's kind of the flip, like kind of a different way of what you're testing, but actually our results are kind of consistent and inconsistent in a way. So I would love to, if you want, I am happy to share a paper, but it's different. It's a little bit about those who trust the regime are more likely to receive the messages and denounce the tolerance for the Islamists. So it's more about the kind of messages they're receiving rather than these people have this deep belief or the stability or instability and that, but it's more about, it's more external. The way you're describing it's more kind of an internalized kind of process. It's not really, it's more about the external cues they're getting from the regime. And really what is conditioning it is how much they trust the regime, not necessarily how much their perceptions of the instability, but it's more about how their perceptions of the regime and how they trust, the levels of their trust in the regime. This is what we found in an experiment. Maybe your paper finds something different, but this is what we found. I'm happy to share the paper if you'd like to have a look at it.
Sure, of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's great to have a debate amongst our presenters as well. So thank you very much. I think.
Dr. Khalid, don't worry about the time. The lunch is not here.
So we're gonna let Dr.
Lunch is
Dr. Russell
on its way.
So we have another question from Dr. Lucas.
Well, thanks. Want to thank all three presenters for wonderful presentations. And especially Professor Hassan for, I think it's about 1 in your time. So
yeah. It's 1:20.
being up late with us.
Yeah.
So one of the things I was trying to do is thinking about the three papers together, and I think the conversation we just had a couple minutes ago taps into this, but maybe I'm trying to formalize this into a comment, into a form of a question. And I think it'll all come back to the kind of agent structure problem that bedevils social science forever. And so one of the things I noticed about the three papers is that kind of there is an interplay between kind of the structure. In some cases that's an institutional structure, but in some cases that's actually a physical structure that is kind of set up by those, say, in power, but is then being used by, for lack of a better term, oppositional elites in trying to, mobilize or represent or perhaps mediate the public as well. And so we have this kind of, three-part dynamic of, structures and agents. And so I guess one of the things I was kind of interested in your paper for each of the panelists, where did you find that this is kind of the explanatory weight is coming from the public, from kind of the oppositional mobilizing elites, or from kind of the structure and those in power, the regime elites, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really enlightening question. I was also trying to think of where the Venn diagram center lands with all of these papers, and I was just simply like, it's got to be Egypt. Yeah, I think I think like thinking about, like, I'm thinking of the Arabic word nizam as just like a catch-all term of regime, of system, of the way people are conditioned and listen to propaganda and act. And so I think all of that is encompassed in our presentations. But your question reminds me of a concept that I'm talking about in another conference next week, which is about the concept of peasant empires and a understanding that any nizam, any system or any regime is absolutely reliant on its subjects and their agreeability to whatever the rulers insist on, or whatever, even if there's very few options that are offered. Yeah, so I'd like to think, even though my paper is talking about how the Ottoman sultans are like working with their subjects, trying to think about what they want. and accommodating them. I think that really shows that it was a peasant empire. The Ottoman period was completely reliant on its subjects to agree for hundreds of years. And when Muhammad Ali decided to be autonomous, that's it. And it was a broad movement of people that supported that. Yeah.
Thank you. So Dr. Hassan or Dr. Shalaby, would you like to respond? And I think we'll have these two comments be the last.
Yeah, as can you hear me? Yeah, as I explained before that the mass opinion is really important to mobilize any to change any regime or to mobilize or to do any government project or agenda. So mass opinion is really important in changing regimes. That's why any autocrats or democrats or whatever, they try to influence the mass and direct them in the direction they want. So, and that's what happened after 2013 when Sisi engaged, gave the people the green light to go out to support him. It was actually like all the media was actually like pressing and pushing people to go out. It's not normal to stay home. Just get out and go out against the regime. Change the regime right now, like that. So people just took it easy and they went out to the streets. And that's what that's what the ruler really needs. That's what the ruler wants, to mobilize people and to influence them, because people's opinion matter at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shalaby?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And as I mentioned in my presentation, and it's something that I always emphasize in my work, how this kind of policy making in authoritarian regimes, it's a very dynamic process. It's not as static because the rules are not clear. And there's always manipulations, always change in the rules. So this creates kind of a very, very dynamic kind of a process that whereas a question that I got was really great about it's how these windows of opportunities, there's a mix of agency, mix of structure, and mix of actual behavior and very rational behavior. So it's really a mix of the three, and windows open and close, the regime would let them go in a little bit and then close it again. And then you would get support from the public, and all of a sudden, like in Morocco, the public don't support them anymore. Like it's very dynamic, and the way it works, I think it's very interesting, and it's way more intriguing than democracies. I always say like policy making in democracy is pretty blah, but in authoritarianism, it's really interesting because the rules are not clear, and the process is ever changing. And you think you understand one legislative session, you look at the second legislative session, and you actually know nothing. So yes, I think it's a mix of the three. It's an institutional structure and a lot of agency and Asian-based patterns as well.
Thank you. And let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Sarkissian, for that. And thanks to all the three panelists for a great panel. Thank you so much. Well, I'm happy to report lunch has arrived. And we will reconvene. So right now it's 11:27. We'll reconvene for our keynote featuring Dr. Amani Jamal at 12:10. So that's in about, what, 43 minutes. All right. Thank you. See you in a bit.